Hi, my name is Cindy Lovell. I am here to introduce you to the Adventures of Tom Sawyer by giving you a little bit of some of the true stories behind the book, which is in the fiction section of the library, but there are a lot of true stories behind this book. I am the former executive director of the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum in Hannibal, Missouri, where this book is set. And I'm also the former executive director of the Mark Twain House and Museum in Hartford, Connecticut, which of course is where Mark Twain was living at the time this book was published. Currently, I'm the Director of Education at Epic Flight Academy in New Smyrna Beach, Florida. So we will continue. I will try to walk you through this pretty quickly so you can get on with a much more fun event, which is reading the actual book. First of all, if you don't have the book, don't worry. You can go online. It's online in many different ways. There are audiobook versions. I like the Gutenberg website because it has all of the illustrations from the original first edition book. So even if you have a different edition and you want to see those illustrations, check it out on Gutenberg. It's really kind of cool to see all the original photo or the original illustrations by True Williams. So let's look at the context of this book. Sam Clemens, of course, Mark Twain's real name was Sam Clemens. Sam was 41 when this book was published. He lived in Hannibal from the age of 4 to 17. So everything that happens in this book is based on things that happened when he was a boy there in Hannibal. Now, when he wrote this, he had two little girls. One, Susie was 4 and Clara was 2. So here he is, this young papa, back when he still had red hair and he didn't have that famous white hair, but he would tell these stories to his girls and write this book. So looking at the dates and thinking about your American history, this book takes place before the Civil War, when slavery was still evident throughout the South. It was certainly there in Hannibal, Missouri. And of course, then it was published after the Civil War. So just things to keep in mind as you're reading the book and trying to put everything into context. I have to throw this in. A lot of people think it's just Mark Twain said it was a book to remind adults of what it was like to be kids. And I love that. I think that's really true. I read the book first as a child in the 4th grade, and I've read it a lot since then. In fact, I don't think I've really ever stopped reading Tom Sawyer. But I will say, if you're wondering about kids and reading this book, you will see the values of conscience and courage and friendship come up again and again. And I'm going to be very careful not to give spoilers here because if you've never read the book, I don't want to be the person to kind of tip you off to things that you'll have a lot of fun discovering on your own. If you have read the book, I promise you as an adult rereading it now, it's just so special. It's nostalgic, it's moving, and all these things really do come up again and again. And it's a book for the ages. It's my favorite. I know that Huckleberry Finn is his greatest work, and I would agree with that. But Tom Sawyer has a special place in my heart. Some of the complaints that have come up about the book down through the years, you can see here, I think they're all worth discussing. I think that's the best part of a good book, is that you will have issues that you want to talk about, investigate, the way we talked about the way Mark Twain wrote racially, the way Tom Sawyer's character disrespected adults, alcohol, tobacco abuse. All these things happened and were written about by Mark Twain. And he, I think they're valid concerns, but I certainly don't think they're a reason to not read the book. I think they're an opportunity to have very healthy discussions, and I encourage you to do that. You have to ask yourself a lot of questions as you're going through this book. And Mark Twain, of course, did not intend to demean anyone with his writing, quite the contrary. So it's another lecture for another day if we were to get into that kind of a topic. But points worth noting. The book has not been so challenged in recent years. Every now and then it will come up, but not too frequently these days. But still, we want to consider all these points and keep them in mind when we're reading it. The characters were based on real people. These are the names. I don't need to read them to you. His friends, his family, people he knew, and we'll talk about them a little bit further along here. Sam himself was the model for Tom Sawyer, and he did say that his friend John Briggs and his other friend Will Bowen had a hand in the character development, but since most of the things that did happen to Sam Clemens, I would say it's safe to say Tom Sawyer and Sam Clemens are one and the same. a boy by the name of Tom Blankenship became Huckleberry Finn. Now, in real life, Blankenship was a very poor child and had a big family, lived in a tiny house. I will share a picture of that here in a few minutes. Mark Twain wrote that he was unwashed and insufficiently fed, but he had as good a heart as any boy ever had. And when you get to the character description of Huckleberry Finn in this book, please pause and savor it. I think it's the most beautiful character description in the English language. And I wish I were reading that chapter, and I envy the person who is. It's a beautiful character description, and it is based on a real boy named Tom Blankenship. The boy Sid Sawyer is based on Sam's younger brother, Henry. Sam was the sixth of 7 children. Henry was the baby. Now, Henry was actually a very good boy. If you meet Sid Sawyer and find you don't care for him too much, just remember that Mark Twain did tell us that Sid was a much better boy, a much finer boy than Sid ever was. You'll meet a very minor character in the book, but an important character is a little boy named Jim, not to be confused with the adult Jim that you will meet in Huckleberry Finn. The young Jim character in Tom Sawyer is an enslaved boy, and he was based on a real boy named Sandy. And I won't read it to you, but you can read the quote here. This is what Jane Clemens said about Sandy one day when young Sam came forward and complained. I think Sandy was making a lot of racket singing, and for whatever reason, Sam went and complained to his mother. And this is what she told him, that when he sings, it shows that he's not remembering, and that comforts me. Slavery was all around. It was an evil that was present all those years in our country. And even though here this family did not own this young boy, they rented his services from another slaveholder. And to allow this to go on and to hold these conflicting views of course, compassion and tenderness, she knows that he's never going to see his mother again, and this makes her heartache. And yet, she's comfortable with enslavement. So you'll see this again and again in Mark Twain's works, and I encourage you to read his works, read about it, read what he had to say about it. His older brother, Orion, of course, was always an abolitionist, but his father was perfectly comfortable with slavery. So very important points, knowing these were real people, and just a note to pause and reflect on this when you encounter these characters. The character of Becky Thatcher was actually a girl named Laura Hawkins who lived across the street. Her home still stands, taken care of by the Mark Twain Boyhood Home and Museum. And later she lived in Hannibal as an adult, and her adult home still stands. The owners have refurbished it. And when you go to Hannibal, you'll see the book kind of open up around you, and it kind of comes to life very easily there in Hannibal. Jane Clemens was the model for Aunt Polly, and there's even a physical resemblance in how True Williams drew her. Although her husband died when Sam was just 11 years old, and at that point Sam left school and went to work, and that was his life. But Jane lived a long life. She and her son they had a lot in common. They both had a great sense of humor and loved a sense of pageantry. She held a grudge just like her son did. They had a lot of good things in common, but she loved animals, and the character of Aunt Polly tending to this nephew of hers, Tom Sawyer, very, very similar to how Jane Clemens had to look after young Sam. The character Injun Joe, not the nicest character in the book, and certainly reflective of attitudes of the time with Native Americans, and again, an important point for discussion as you're reading this. Believed to have been based on a Hannibal person by the name of Joe Douglas, who lived to be over 100 years old and is actually buried near the Clemens family out there in Hannibal. But he did not like being known for this, and he was known to be a very nice man. And whether or not this really was the model, there's some debate about that, but still you'll see the depiction there and can draw your own conclusions. The character of Muff Potter figures heavily in the book, and he was based on a drunken tramp who visited Hannibal, and he was locked up in the little jail there. And as a boy, this was in 1849 this happened. So Sam was just a young boy, and this fellow was in the jail, and he asked the boys for tobacco and matches, and Sam Clemens actually gave him some. And terrible story, the tramp set a fire in the jail and burned to death. And it haunted Sam Clemens. He said that he always felt very guilty about that he was responsible, even though he was just a boy who had owned the matches. But he took this man and kind of took his traits and characteristics and turned him into this man, Muff Potter, that you'll meet in the book. Joe Harper is the friend of young Tom Sawyer, gets up to some hijinks and adventures. He was, Sam said he was based on the character Will Bowen. You'll see here a letter on the screen is a letter to Will Bowen. They remain friends throughout their adulthood. This letter comes from the Mark Twain Project at Berkeley. I encourage you to go online to marktwainproject.org and lose yourself in the letters and other writings. Of course, Tom Sawyer is online there, and they have all the notations and a lot of great background information for all of this. So if you want to read the authentic letters that Sam Clemens wrote to his friends, you can do it on their website. It's a great resource. The Widow Douglas is a kind of a minor character, but important in the book. And she was a real person. In the book, she's described as fair, smart, and 40. And she was widowed twice and consulted fortune tellers and always expected to marry again. But as Mark Twain wrote, she did have the only palace in town, and you'll see her popping up, but she was a real person there. The Widow Holiday became the Widow Douglas in the book. And the hill that she lived on, where her mansion was Holiday's Hill when he was a boy, but in the book he changed it to Cardiff Hill. In fact, him changing it in the book meant that Hannibal ultimately had to succumb and just change the name of Holiday's Hill to Cardiff Hill, and it is still called Cardiff Hill, named for this fictional place in the book Tom Sawyer. The places and events, of course, the homes, the cave, cemetery, all these places were real in Hannibal. They were places he explored as a boy. In the book, he calls Hannibal St. Petersburg, but these are the real names of the places in real life. McDougal's Cave is now known as Mark Twain Cave, so that has changed. But you can go to Hannibal and walk around and see most of these places. Of course, the haunted house is long gone and the old schoolhouse and things like that, but the river is there, Jackson's Island, the cave, of course, you can go and see it all. I wanted to share this painting by John Stobart. He depicts Hannibal here as it would have looked during Sam Clemens' time. And this white house to the left and the white picket fence is the boyhood home. You can see how close they were to the river. So they did have access to go to that river. It was their playground, their backyard, if you will, Jackson's Island and all that. Here's the boyhood home as it stands today with the whitewashing, Cardiff Hill in the distance. And it's easy to imagine Aunt Polly chasing Tom, who's going over the fence. Of course, it would have been reversed. He would have been coming out to the street to make his escape there. The Old Baptist Cemetery in Hannibal really conjures the setting in the cemetery when Huck comes meowing for Tom one night, and they go off to have what they think will be an innocent kind of adventure. Turns pretty dark pretty fast. But again, I don't want to spoil it for you, but just know that when you're reading about this, you can still come to Hannibal and see these places and understand how Mark Twain got his inspiration. The cave, there's no picture I can share with you that will do this justice. The cave has 260 passageways. If they were to be connected together, it would equal 3 miles. So there's a lot of exploring to do in the cave. There are 250,000 names written throughout the cave. I won't spend a lot of time other than tell you that after decades of looking and thinking it would never happen, last summer I actually found Sam Clemens' signature in the cave, and that's another story. You'll just have to Google that, but I have to put that signature in. And picture, this was about 17 years old when Sam Clemens wrote this on the wall of the cave where he played as a boy. The Mississippi River, of course, is kind of a major character. The boys go out and have adventures, whether they're on a raft, whether they borrow a little boat from somebody. They get out onto the river, and it figures heavily, of course, Jackson's Island. You'll love and cherish the adventures on Jackson's Island. And of course, if you read Huckleberry Finn, you know Huckleberry Finn also, it kind of starts at Jackson's Island as a jumping off point in the book. So lots to see there and lots to connect to real life. The courthouse scene, Sam Clemens' father, John Marshall Clemens, was the justice of the peace in Hannibal. So Sam Clemens witnessed his share of court cases as a boy. So all of these experiences, again, figure into the book. And of course, beautiful Cardiff Hill, just like the cave. A picture's not going to do it justice. Today, you'll see there is a statue of Tom and Huck at the foot of the hill, but it is very pristine, and you can walk up to the top of the hill. There's a road you can drive around it, and pretty easy to conjure up the adventures of Tom Sawyer and his friends playing up there. And of course, the Becky Thatcher home, which is owned by the Mark Twain Boyhood Home, has been restored. It's directly across the street from Sam Clemens' boyhood home. So very convenient. All the kids live nearby. The Tom Blankenship house, the Huckleberry Finn house, is right behind the Clemens home. It's just a stone's throw, tiny, tiny little place. It fell down and was rebuilt using authentic materials from the period, so you can at least get a sense of how the Blankenships lived. The events in the book, Mark Twain was in London in 1872 and having dinner with some friends, and told them, as he put it, he told them about the whitewashing of the fence by Tom Sawyer, and thereby captured a chapter on cheap terms, for I wrote it out when I got back to the hotel while it was fresh in my mind. So there he was entertaining friends at dinner and had such a good time recalling this that he went back to his room and he wrote down that chapter, which now is just iconic. We know this chapter, whether we've read this book or not. We know the whitewashing scene, and you can go to Hannibal and pose with a paintbrush and pretend you're Tom Sawyer. You'll encounter the sugar bowl scene pretty early, and Mark Twain tells us that other than it wasn't Tom and Sid, it was actually Sam and Henry that this happened to. And the same with Peter and the painkiller. Perry Davis's painkiller was a well-known medication at the time, very commonly used. And it's a funny scene. It really happened. And Sam Clemens told us all about that as well. So when you read this book, you're going to ask yourself, how much of this is true? Probably 95% of this book really happened. So he changed the names, changed a few things, but you will find it on the fiction shelf. The Cadets of Temperance. You might be familiar with the Sons of Temperance. Back in the day, temperance was nothing new. There have always been groups trying to get people to swear off drinking, whatever. In this case, they had a little junior group, the Cadets of Temperance, for children. And they took a pledge not to smoke and not to drink alcohol and things like this. And of course, as you'll read, Mark Twain said the surest way to not want to do it, the surest way to make a body want to do a thing is to promise that you won't do that very thing. And you'll see that poor Tom Sawyer joins the Cadets of Temperance, and then, of course, everything's all about temptation. But I want you to know is that this is the original roster from Hannibal, and you'll see the very first name on this list is Samuel Clemens, but with the withdrawn written beside it. So Sam could only stay a member a short time, and then he just couldn't take it anymore, whether he needed a smoke or whatever reason he withdrew. You can look down at the bottom of the list, though, and see number 18 was Henry Clemens. So young Henry stayed in as a member of the Cadets of Temperance. Yes, the boys would sneak out and go off on their adventures at night. This was common. This is a picture of the house from back before the addition was removed on the left, so you can see what it would have looked like for Tom. That was Sam Clemens' bedroom there in the back, and he would climb out, as he called it, on the L of the roof, and off he would go with Tom Blankenship and the other boys. So that was all true. Digging for treasure, of course, he talked about all the boys did that in Hannibal, and I imagine some of the girls did too. So lots of youthful things, having superstitions and playing hooky from school. The incident at the Welshman's house was based in reality. Apparently, there was a young Californian there who had too much to drink and showed up at a widow's house making quite a ruckus. Well, as he tells us, she loaded an old musket with slugs and warned him, and he didn't desist, and she shot him, and he remembered the details of this tragedy. As a boy, he witnessed it, and he sort of modified it and put it in the book under this incident at the Welshman's house that you'll read about when you pick up the book. This is what the Welshman's house looks like today in Hannibal. It is actually the museum called Jim's Journey, the Huck Finn Freedom Center. Lovely museum. It's all about Hannibal's African-American history, which for many years was a story not being told. So Faye Dant runs this and does a wonderful job, and it's a great place to visit in Hannibal. So all of these things that you're going to encounter, lots of adventure, lots of humor, a lot of suspense. but all based on the reality of this little boy, Sam Clemens, who grew up in Hannibal, immortalized Hannibal in the book, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And even though he had to go to work at the age of 12 and support himself, luckily, all of this from his childhood stayed with him, and he preserved it in the book. And happy that you're about to read it. When you get to the end, as Mark Twain said, so endeth this chronicle. So I will leave it there and say, have a good time. You are going to enjoy this.